for all of those you who don't speak Spanish, don't be afraid. The rest of my introduction will be in English, which will be better than my Spanish. So I'm Carol Lancaster, the Dean of the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown University. It is my great honor, all of our great honor and pleasure, to introduce Her Excellency Cristina Fernández de Kirchner, the President of the Argentine Republic. I would like to recognize also His Excellency Héctor Timerman, Foreign Minister of Argentina, His Excellency Jorge Arguello, Ambassador of the Argentine Republic to the United States, and Professor Eric Langer, Director of the Center for Latin American Studies here at Georgetown. This is the first lecture in the Cátedra Argentina, which will be a series of lectures here on the campus of Georgetown University that will deal with issues of all kinds of themes, issues of culture, of politics, of economics, of the role of Argentina in the region, in the hemisphere, in the world, and will all give us a chance to dialogue and to learn more about this very important country. President Kirchner is the first elected female president of Argentina. We're very pleased about that. You're giving us a good example in the United States. She was elected in December 2007. She was elected to a second term in 2011, and she was the first woman president to be reelected in Argentina. So many congratulations. She has been a leader in the hemisphere and the world, actively participating in the G20, in UNASUR, and the Group of 77, among other organizations. In Argentina, she began a universal child benefit plan and has been a strong advocate of prosecuting those responsible for human rights violations during Argentina's so-called dirty war. She has achieved a host of other accomplishments on both domestic and international stages during her presidency. We at Georgetown are very pleased to have President Kirchner here to deliver this first inaugural lecture of the Cátedra Argentina. I want to offer my thanks in particular to Ambassador Arguello, who was instrumental in bringing this event to Georgetown. We hope that this is the first of many opportunities we have to foster a dialogue about your country and among academicians and policymakers. President Kirchner will speak, and at the end of her talk, she will take questions from our students, time permitting. President Kirchner, welcome again to Georgetown. Thank you very much for coming, and I look forward to your remarks.
Good morning, students, academicians, Argentines joining us here on this inaugural lecture of the Cátedra Argentina, which was actually quite a surprise to me when the ambassador announced the inauguration at Georgetown, which, by the way, I've had a pleasure to lecture at quite a few years ago. I recall it was a seminar I was invited to lecture on media and political campaigns. This is my second chance to speak at Georgetown, but I was particularly interested by the creation of a Cátedra Argentina, an Argentina chair, which is not subsidized by the Argentine government, but is actually part of the contributions made by privates. We would also like to thank the university for its interest in learning more about Latin America and South America, which is the region Argentina belongs to. And this has to do with something I discussed a few years ago with the then president of the University of Columbia. During an exchange of views, we said that following the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the end of the Cold War, at all US universities and at all US institutions, think tanks really were looking forward to trying to learn about the reality and circumstances of all countries. Obviously, the US during the Cold War was vying for space vis-à-vis the Soviet Union, and had obviously paid a lot of attention to developments worldwide. And during our discussions with the president of Colombia, and following the fall of the Berlin Wall, we both mentioned the fact that the United States seemed to be looking somewhat more inwards, and many Americans and academicians had started looking inwards more and seemed no longer so interested in developments outside the country, but rather within the United States. And I said, it's really bad news. I mean, if you struggle so much to become the world's leading power, and then somehow forget a bit about the rest of the world, it would be bad news. This is why I was so pleased to hear about the creation of this chair, which will allow an exchange of views and make it possible to convey more about what Argentina is and what its role is in the region. I think in order to understand Argentina, one needs to consider the differences and not only the similarities, especially vis-à-vis the United States. Since we both have constitutional systems which are very similar. In fact, the Argentine constitution is a copy of the Constitution of the United States. To be quite frank, we weren't very original, since we copied the US Constitution and then introduced some amendments, but they do not differ substantially in terms of the form of government. It's a presidential system with parliamentary checks and balances, two houses, independent judiciary. Now, if we compare the 200 years of our history and, well, some more than 200 years of US history, many people may wonder how it is that Argentina, the 8th largest country with vast natural resources and wealth and very highly skilled human resources, how could such a country have suffered from so many recurrent crises? And here I like to draw a comparison with the history of the United States. I think we were both born as colonies, both countries, one as a colony of the British Empire and ours as a colony of the Spanish Empire. The United States became independent a few years before we did, but it was basically the same historical period, a world imbued with freedom ideals, the autonomy and independence of colonies, and so on. So what was it that prevented Argentina, which during the 50s was the first or leading Latin American economy with the largest GDP in Latin America, what led to Argentina having so many problems along its history? I think this has to do with some mistakes of our own and conceptions we had in our country, and also this has to do with interactions in the Americas, which also involved, of course, the United States in its position as a world power and with a very important influence in Latin America. I think a turning point was probably the Civil War in the United States, and in our case, the Battle of Caseros in Argentina. You may wonder what this Caseros battle was about. The Caseros battle led to the defeat of a growing project for our country, a country that was seeking to add value to its products, to industrialize its products, which until then basically were all about raw materials being exported mainly to England, where value was added, which left us in the position of mere producers of raw materials and commodities. And this began to change following the taking of office of a number of men and women. The most representative figure, and I know this will be controversial for my country, but I think it's good to have some polemics and to have some differences of views. You know, Rosas, with his bright sides and his darker sides. No man in history has been free of bright and dark sides. I think the only one who escapes this category is God. Rosas and other men believed in adding value to our products, to our hides, in order for us not to just export raw hides to the United States, which would then come back to us as boots and footwear. Beef, for instance, perhaps we would export living cattle, but then they would like to have the tanning and so on and so forth done in Argentina. You may wonder what this has to do with the civil war in the US. Quite simple. Apart from Uncle Tom's Cabin, this story about the fight against slavery, which was obviously a milestone, the Argentine Republic was actually one of the countries among the first to liberate slaves. And the Civil War in the United States was against the backdrop of a discussion which had to do with the sort of model of a country. The South, on the one hand, the cotton growers, who were for slavery. They wanted to continue to be exporters of raw materials and have cheap labor, hence the slaves. And on the other hand, the North, represented by Lincoln, General Washington, who wanted to see African Americans working in factories, adding value to the cotton grown in the South, and earning a salary that would allow them to buy shirts and clothes, and this would lead to a strong domestic growth and to industry. In other words, a country that would not just produce resources, which are also widely available in the States, but also to have value added to the products. And here, General Washington prevailed, and not General Lee. And in my own country, I won't mention the name of the general who won, but let us say it was the namesake or the counterpart of General Lee. Those who wanted to be one more gem or pearl on the crown of the British Empire, and who wanted to continue producing raw materials with ups and downs, with intervals, with the advent of vote for all people. We had different governments, also popular governments, which pursued a national policy in foreign affairs, incorporating large segments of the middle classes. Of course, we had the influx of immigration at the end of the 19th century and in the early 20th century. I myself, I'm the granddaughter of Spanish immigrants. 3 of my grandparents were Spaniards, and former President Kirchner. Well, I did have something to do with Argentine history because I had a Spanish background, but my former husband had a Croatian, German, and Swiss background. And that is Argentina for you, a highly diverse country, a true melting pot with a very strong immigration base. And we now see the third wave of immigration in our country with Latin American immigrants, Uruguayans, Paraguayans, Bolivians, who also represent much of the labor force in our country. Many economists have defined the ups and downs in Argentina as economic stop-and-go processes. I think it has been a permanent struggle between 2 projects for the country. One, representing a model of a country that wanted to do the sort of thing that the United States does or did. The maquilas, manufacturing abroad is also quite an issue in the United States. But until not so long ago, the United States was a huge industrial power with workers that earned very good wages, which made it possible for the American dream to come true, with workers having a chance to become presidents, for instance, the true incarnation of the American dream. And we had similar tensions in Argentina. And of course, I'm a Peronist. I belong to the political party of Peronism. But another milestone in the history of Argentina was the emergence of Peronism. Some think it was the emergence or the rise of General Perón. I think General Perón was a result of history, a result of what happened in Argentina with the beginning of an import substitution period during the First World War and increasing during the Second World War. And since the world was at war, Argentina began import substitution, thereby developing a strong industry which in the 1950s turned it into the country with the largest GDP in Latin America. We developed the first jets in Argentina. We also had a strong railway and car industry. We had a strong merchant navy force, as well as a workers' movement with a high degree of unionization, which enabled very good distribution of income. And we still have the best income distribution in Latin America. And on the other hand, the interaction with the United States, not only with Argentina, but with the rest of the region. And Braden was a famous ambassador, strongly opposed to Perón being a candidate. He also headed the demonstration of the opposition. Now, if that were at all to happen, it would be done in a less overt way. Of course, there is a joke making the rounds. They say the only place in the Americas where there are coups is in the United States. And why? Because there are no American embassies. And this is why. Anyway, the American ambassador, Braden, at the time, headed demonstrations against Perón. And that was also a milestone, which I think marked or led to a certain caution against intervention. And of course, this is something that applies not only to Argentina, but to all of the region. Let us not forget that in the 1930s, the British Empire fell, the pound sterling was no longer convertible, and the hegemony of the states, of the United States, became quite clear at the time. And of course, the Russian bear also rose, leading to this bipolar world and to the Cold War. Latin America, Argentina, Chile, Uruguay, and Brazil were also clear stages that provide a background for the Cold War through military coups and the national security doctrine. It is also, in all fairness, to say that during the bloodiest coup in memory, probably even bloodier than Pinochet's, if you consider the number of casualties, even though numbers are quite an issue. I would like to here recall Jimmy Carter, former President Jimmy Carter, who alongside his Human Rights Secretary played a very leading role in acting against human rights violations taking place in my country at the time, which eventually led to the release of some Argentines who, had it not been for Jimmy Carter, would have lost their lives. One is the father of our foreign minister, who was a journalist, Jacobo Timmerman, who wasn't just incarcerated, but also tortured. And thanks to the good office of Jimmy Carter and the strong pressure of the Jewish community here in the United States, it was possible for him to be released. Otherwise, he would probably been another desaparecido. He would have also disappeared. And the dictatorship also had good relations with Russia, with the Soviet Union, because the Argentine dictatorship did not respect the grain embargo proclaimed or declared by the United States against the Soviet Union. This is something that the left-wing parties sometimes forget. So there was the Videla dictatorship on the one hand and the Pinochet dictatorship on the other. So I mean, we need to demystify some of the positions and abstract positions in politics and talk real politics, realpolitik. And, well, Argentina had got to income distribution close to 50-50, which has always been a very important cause for Peronism. We don't see capital and labor or the workforce as opposed. We believe in distribution, 50% for capital, 50% for the workers. But when we had the military coup on March 24th, 1976, Argentina was very close to this 50-50. The foreign debt was around $5 billion. And aside from the problems in terms of violence, which were not exclusive to our region, but rather were taking place in the whole world, this led to a period of decadence, of deindustrialization, which would not stop and which eventually led to an implosion in 2001. Just to give an idea, there was a TV commercial during the military dictatorship about a man sitting down in a chair that said "Made in Argentina," and the chair would break. And then he would sit on one that said "Made in China," or "Made in the US," or "Made in Germany," and it was nice and sturdy and strong. This one thing, a story I told in Germany, and the Germans stared with eyes wide open, and they couldn't believe that someone in a country would be advertising against products manufactured in the country itself, thereby encouraging the sales of products made in other countries. And this has not anything to do with chauvinism, but or nationalism or xenophobia, but rather because this means less work for our fellow country people and less investments by our own business people and more hunger and more poverty. We would then get into the 80s decade, which many call the lost decade. It was lost not only for Argentina, but for all of Latin America. Somebody mentioned the Brady bonds the other day. I think the decade was lost for some of us, those in Latin America. But for those in the North, those who got the Brady bonds, it was a time of very handsome profit. So we should reconsider who this was the last decade for, probably, and certainly for our societies, which had to shoulder the burden of the capital transfer crisis taking place in the world at the time due to the oil prices. Let's say this clearly. The 90s would then come with the Washington Consensus, which relegated the state as a bit of a bother, a nuisance for production and for the economy, something that had to be set aside, deregulating. And of course, we always have regulation. It's either government regulation or market regulation, but it's not true that there are deregulated or regulation-free economies. There are always rules. The rules may be set by the government, by the executive branch, by the legislative, or perhaps a court ruling, the judiciary. And if it's not the state and democracy, then it'll be the economy through the rules it itself imposes, because users, consumers, and workers are not in a position to set rules or impose them upon banks or companies or large investors or large media or economic consortia. In the 90s, we see the emergence of a theory, of an Argentine, not at Georgetown, but at Harvard. He teaches at Harvard. I'll be going there tomorrow. And the convertibility theory arrives on the scene, the currency board. The principle being that a peso is worth $1. And of course, you may wonder, what's going on? What does this mean? What is she talking about? 1 peso equals $1? If the currency unit of a country is to express the size and weight of an economy, it is clear that 1 peso can never equal $1. It suffices to look at the economy and size of Argentina on the one hand, and on the other at the size and relative weight of a country that accounted for 25 to 30% of world GDP with all of its technological, financial, and military power. Obviously, what we had was a fictitious economy. But how was this sustained? It was sustained through the sale of assets. All assets, whether it be electricity companies, oil, gas, everything was privatized. The only country in Latin America that privatized its energy sources, its oil and its gas. Even Pinochet didn't go as far as that. The military didn't go as far as that in our country either. Pinochet kept Codelco, and he made sure that part of this was also maintained for the armed forces. But in Argentina, privatization went beyond that. Even the telephone company, there weren't even just concessions, but the actual ownership of telephone companies and utilities was transferred. Our flagship airline, oil company YPF, which was founded by President Hipólito Yrigoyen and headed by General Mosconi, who was a whole symbol at the time. All of this was then sustained through the sale of assets plus indebtedness. When Argentina imploded in 2001, because the currency board or convertibility was maintained, since the administration that followed President Menem's, the government of the alliance, the Alianza Party, ran a debt of up to 160% of our GDP. So what we see in the Eurozone today and in some of its countries with a monstrous debt to GDP ratio also happened in the Argentine Republic in such a manner that it led to the largest default in memory. This was in 2001. And this in turn led to millions of Argentines seeing their savings in pesos or dollars confiscated because the banks didn't return the savings, bonds were issued, there was 25 unemployment, companies failed. I remember I was a senator at the time, and I used to leave the Senate building very late at night to go back home, and I would walk past the consulate of Spain. I saw a Spanish flag out there on my way into this venue, and there would be queues going all the way around the corner of the consulate because people wanted to leave their country. And in fact, thousands of Argentines left for Spain and other countries looking for new horizons. And the IMF, which throughout the 1990s had praised the Argentine government as a true model, so much so that it would invite the Argentine president to the annual assemblies of the organization. And of course, it decided to leave Argentina to its own devices, obviously withdrawing the positions of all the banks. There was a jumbo swap on the one hand, and basically this involved apparent loans being given to Argentina, $30 billion or $10 billion or $20 billion, which actually never entered Argentina. These were just book entries, so there were accounting entries, so that those who had placed dollars in Argentina at a rate of 16% a year, when the rest of the world was only paying 2%, allowing those investors to leave. If you look at the newspapers a couple of weeks or even a couple of days before the 20th of December of 2001, which not only involved the fall of Argentina, but also the death of 20 Argentine citizens due to the brutal repression at the time. If you look at the accounts of the time, the newspapers seem to be saying that everything was fine and wonderful because everything was secured and guaranteed by the jumbo swaps and all of the packages allowed by the IMF. So any similarity with what is now happening in the Eurozone may seem like a mere coincidence, as often appears at the beginning or end of a film, but I see a lot of similarities really. And let me recall that 24% of the reserves of the central banks around the world is denominated in euros. So sustaining the euro is not just a matter of nostalgia or romance, but also it has to do with economic interests apart from common sense. So Argentina was a country ravaged, not only politically and economically, because someone may have economic problems, but still have hopes that they may see the light at the end of the tunnel. But there was this loss of hope, also feeling that everything outside the country was better and that we were good for nothing. At the Ezeiza Airport, the International Airport of Buenos Aires, there was a big sign. Eduardo Unnequian is here. He's the concessionaire of the airport. And the sign said, please let the last one to leave turn the light off. we then came into another period just before the campaign that led to President Kirchner's taking of office, there was another sign asking people not to leave because Kirchner would be coming to office. And then one of the key pillars of our administration was human rights. When President Kirchner first took office, they were about to rule the constitutionality of the due obedience and full stop laws. So this was tantamount to one of the powers of the state making torture, disappearance, murder, state terrorism legal. Today, Argentina, with the judges and justices appointed according to the Constitution, is a model in terms of respect for human rights and of trials of those responsible for the atrocities committed during the years of the dictatorship. And all of this within the framework of the laws, with all due privileges and rights, which is no gracious concession, but rather this is a right inherent in every citizen, even if they are criminals. And I think this represents the Western values and the values that all people in all countries should have. In 2005, we restructured our debt during the term of President Nestor Kirchner, and the final part of the restructuring, which amounted to 94% of all of the debt, was during my first term of office. The idea being that if someone puts money in a bank and gets 16% interest on the dollars, whereas in the rest of the world they only get 2%, it's obvious that there will be a risk that you won't get your money back. I mean, just think about the examples here in the United States. Just to make you understand what sort of a principle we followed when restructuring the debt. What we thought was that those who had placed their money in our country, knowing that this was an impossible amount to repay, something that the country wouldn't be able to bear, the idea was to share the risk that had been assumed. Anyway, Argentina ended up repaying much more than Enron, which is a good example to draw a parallel here in the States. I think Enron basically repaid $1 out of every $100. We returned between 25 and 30 out of every $100. And we are paying on a timely, punctual basis. The difference being that we have no access to the capital markets. Everything that is being paid in Argentina is without access to the capital markets. At the height of the crisis, people were chanting slogans saying that they wanted all politicians out, and all of the bonds and debts and the instruments that were created in exchange for the deposits are being repaid by our government. The deposits and savings confiscated in 2001 were finally repaid in 2012. We repaid $2.3 billion, and all of this we have done without asking for a single cent, borrowing a single cent, with no access to the capital markets, as I say. This was part of the policy pursued in our country, a policy of reindustrialization and of growth of our domestic market, so as to be able to produce and have dollars in our trade balance. Unfortunately, we issue no dollars. We would love to be able to do that, to issue US dollars, but we don't. So the only dollars that come in are those that come in through tourism, or through our trade balance, or through foreign direct investment. Those are the three sources of dollar income for an economy such as ours. An economy which is also culturally highly dependent on the dollar, not only due to the convertibility, but as a result of it later, just to give an idea, after the United States, the country with the largest amount of dollars in the world is in Argentina. More dollars are held in Argentina than by other countries. Do you know how many dollars every Brazilian holds, for instance? Brazil being the 5th, 6th, or 7th largest economies of the world, $6. So every Brazilian holds on average $6, and that's one of the largest economies in the world. And Argentina, it's a whole lot more. And transactions in any other country in Latin America are made in their own currencies, and that has not been the case in Argentina. We pursued a strong policy of industrialization by adding value, creating work. We have created over 5.5 million jobs. We have, for the first time in our history, allocated over 5% of our GDP to education, over 6% in fact, 6.47 of our GDP. Over 900 scientists who had gone abroad have returned to our country. We created the Minister for Science and Technology, and we also allocated substantial resources to the whole science and technology system, to our CONICET, National Institute for Technology, who had once been asked to go and do the dishes. And we said, no, don't do that. Get hold of your microscopes, your glasses, and start doing research. We have also developed strong technology in the field of agriculture, which puts us at the forefront of the most competitive countries in the field of agricultural production. I would say we are the most competitive due to the science, technology, and investments in Argentina. The pharmaceutical and software industry has grown a lot too. We are the Latin American country with the highest number of software exports. We have also enacted a software promotion law, which has also strongly encouraged the development of this industry. And even more importantly, and even more important than just economic figures, we have strongly reduced the levels of poverty and extreme poverty in Argentina, which during the second half of 2003 reached truly scandalous heights. Over 54% poor, over 23% extreme poor, a Gini index, if my memory serves me right, of 0.554, 0.518, as opposed to currently 0.38 something or 0.410. But you, as academicians, know how hard it is to move even a tiny notch the Gini index, and you know the effort this takes. We have introduced a Conectar Igualdad program, which is Connection for Equality, a plan to, or program to reduce the digital divide so that all high school students and students in state schools get computers so that they can have access to the digital world. Our universities have received funds like never before in Argentine history, and the salaries of university lecturers and professors are now decent, and this means that there is a lot of recognition of the role of scientists nowadays in Argentina. In Argentina, there was always a sort of division between the university world and the economic world. And one of the big cultural battles we're fighting in Argentina is aimed at bringing university and academia closer to the field of science, of the economy, and of politics. And that's key. The way it's been done in Germany and in the United States, an approach that makes science and knowledge something that is not unrelated to the economy or to production. It shouldn't be seen as sinful that universities come close to the economy. I don't need to mention this to you because most universities here are paying in Argentina. They are free of charge. Of course, we do have private universities as well. Our system is, I dare say, almost unique in Latin America. This is why we also get lots of foreign Latin American students who come to study in our country due to the quality of our education services, and also because studying in other Latin American countries is prohibitive. But anyway, I don't want to carry on for too long, otherwise I'll take away time for students or lecturers to ask questions. But the fact is that this Argentina today is quite a different Argentina in a world that is also quite a different one. We have also paid off our debt to the International Monetary Fund, which has given us autonomy in our policies. We have also succeeded in making our workers, and this is something that business people may not like that much because they say they lose competitiveness, but the wages of Argentine workers are the best in all of Latin America. I'm not talking only in nominal terms, but as measured by the International Monetary Fund or by ECLAC in terms of purchasing power parity, which is the way you should measure wages, not only in nominal terms, but also in terms of purchasing power parity. So our task is to recover things in Argentina and in the region. I don't want to talk just about Argentina, but about the Latin American compatriots, the South Americans, the Americans of the South. UNASUR is an organization that has managed to resolve conflicts in the region that also pose threats to democracy, and also not depending on formal mechanisms that often failed due to their rigidity. And we have managed to find agreement and consensus between the leaders of the region in a context of common fora to discuss, to listen to each other, and to make decisions, despite our differences. An example, when there was a crisis in Bolivia, an attempt to overthrow President Evo Morales with human rights violations in the region of Panto. I remember the then president of Chile was Michelle Bachelet, and she and I organized a meeting in the La Moneda Presidential Palace of Chile, and we convened the presidents of UNASUR to support Evo Morales, and we set up a human rights committee that visited the country to verify the violations there. And I think we managed to thwart the destabilization coup, because we feel that an attack against the democracy of any country in the region, even if it's not our own country, has a truly destabilizing effect for the whole region. And we acted in a similar way when the events took place in Ecuador against Correa, the police forced rebellion, which was also an attempted coup. And in less than 24 hours in Buenos Aires at the foreign ministry, we had a meeting of the presidents and foreign ministers of the region, and within 24 hours, this was avoided. And by way of a tribute, perhaps I would like to make a comment regarding the worst crisis in our region, which, by the way, we also took part against the conflict between Colombia and Ecuador, and also when we had the issues between Colombia and Venezuela, and the then General Secretary of UNASUR acted, President Kirchner, and he acted in a very discreet, diplomatic manner, which finally brought both countries and presidents closer, and this diffused something that would have been disastrous for the stability of a region, as would have been a conflict between Venezuela and Colombia. So this is just an overview of Argentina, of the region. I won't talk about the world because this is a chair on Argentina. I'll leave the references to the world for tomorrow at my other lecture, otherwise I'll have to repeat the same. It'll be very boring for those with me and for myself. I always like to face new challenges. But I thought it would be useful, as part of this introduction to the Argentina chair, to take a quick look at our history, at our commonalities, the conflicts, the interactions between the United States and Argentina, the United States and the region, also with a look at the history of Argentina and the vision we have ruling in Argentina, which is obviously a vision that is not the only one, but at least it represents the views of this president speaking here, who got elected for a second term with 54% of the vote. When President Nestor Kirchner was voted president, only 22% of the voters voted for him, because there was no second round of the election. The other candidate stepped out. And even so, with only 22% of the vote and the country in flames, President Kirchner managed to turn around the country economically, socially, and educationally in an unprecedented manner, no matter how far back in history you search and what yardstick you choose. We are looking at debt being now 13 or 14% of GDP. Remember, I said at the beginning it was 160%. The real debt of the public or private sector is now 13 to 14%. And in dollars, it's not even 2 digits. It's between 8 and 9%. We have accumulated reserves like never before in our history, which makes it possible, has thus far made it possible for us to be spared of the fluctuations in international markets with the constant ups and downs, with capital coming in and out and subject to no regulation. And President Kirchner managed this with only 22% of the vote. When we had our election last year, this project, which is the same project, not just because I am his wife, but also because we have been active in the same party with the same view for our country and for the world, and of what policy should be as an instrument for change and transformation in society. And after 8 years in office, we got 54.11% of the vote, and the second most voted candidate, I believe, got around scarcely 20%. So, despite the differences which always exist in a country, it's impossible for 100% of the people to think the same. It would also be very boring. That would be no democracy. It would be something else. It is impossible to have 100% of the population happy with each and every measure you adopt, especially when many of those measures affect sectors that were privileged or that had power in Argentina for a long time. But that's what elections are for, that's what democracy is for, and each election allows citizens to express what they want for the country, for the government, and for their lives. I would once again like to thank the authorities of the university for the kind invitation, and also for the chance to speak at the inauguration of this Argentina chair, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Madam President, thank you.
Señor Presidente, muchas gracias por lo que fue un panorama extraordinario de la historia argentina y su comparación a la historia de Estados Unidos. Y ahora aprecio sumamente su disposición a aceptar preguntas.
Translate.
Without glasses.
All right. Let me just make sure,
Deseo asegurarme que todo el mundo tenga auricular, quienes necesitan uno, para propósitos de traducción. ¿Todos tienen sus auriculares?
Georgetown habla español y
Don't speak Spanish and English, right?
entonces
It doesn't matter. Let's start with questions. And I've promised the president, the other president, that the students, even if they are graduates in Latin American studies, may ask the first questions. Lady, and I ask you to please present yourself, introduce yourself, and shall we say, not give your personal history, but a little bit of your background. What you're doing in Georgetown, or what other countries you've been? Well, our country. Thank you. I'm from Mexico. I'm the president of the Latin American Studies here in Georgetown, and I am representing the number of students who have been giving us the pleasure of being present. What I wanted to ask you a bit more is the purpose for why we are gathered here, because there's a lot of history in Georgetown. You know, it's one of the main institutions in the U.S., but it is including many people who come from other interests and join people from different countries and backgrounds. And what we wanted to continue is gathering these people together and having them have a better understanding of what's in Argentina and what we in Georgetown can do to collaborate to help you bring a connection and dialogue with Argentina in the future, especially with this Cátedra Argentina.
Yo he sido antes que
More than Cátedra Argentina, before being a president, I've been
yo
I have been a lawyer apart from being a student. So apart from contributing to your view, and of course, aside from the view I may have, which may be subjective, we each have an ideology and a worldview, a perception of the world, values. It's about axiology. We all have that. I think aside from the Argentina chair, the duty of every academician, of every student, is to have their own view. I think that what actually determines the levels and standards of excellence of a university has to do with offering instruments to analyze in a truly unbiased way the reality not only of Latin America but also of one's own country and of the world. It is no novelty if I say that we live in quite a different society from the one that I studied in. It's quite a different world from the world when I was a student. Back then, in the 1970s, I said 60s first, but it was in the 70s, and I want to look even older. You were also there in the 70s, honey. Anyway, in the 60s, there was the hippie movement, which was obviously so strong here in the United States against the Vietnam War, for peace. Well, the French or the events in Paris in 1968. It was a counterfactual power world. It was a world in which youth and universities challenged the factor powers, the way they were developing in societies. There was very little influence for the media. There was no IT. I'm digitally illiterate. If you give me a computer, I can hardly plug it in. I still read actual newspapers. I don't mind getting my hands soiled with ink. I still read books the old-fashioned way, the way I did when I was a student. But that's not the world of my daughter, who's 22 and who will only communicate over the web. It's a different world now. But I think in both, we needed and need to use the instruments that world and this world often and offer in order to see how we can understand. Because it's one thing to have knowledge, to know. Universities convey knowledge. They train you to become a doctor, engineer, economist. They give you technical instruments, techniques, skills for you to be able to resolve issues or problems. But that's about knowledge. Now, understanding and grasping is different. There are people who may know about all things but understand little, and others who don't know so much, but since they're not so contaminated by other factors, may have a higher degree of understanding, which is not intellectual but empirical, based on our own experiences. When you're a university student, normally, in my country or here, you have a certain economic standard. It's clear that none of the students here, and of course there might be personal histories and backgrounds, but everyone has been fortunate enough to have a more or less comfortable life in terms of access to the basic assets you need to develop. And I think the most important thing a university can do is open up people's minds. I was very proud some time ago to see the University of Padua in Italy, one of the world's most prestigious universities, awarded a prize to my late husband, which I was unable to receive personally, so the foreign minister went, but it was the first award of the university in the field of human rights. And when you consider that Galileo was there discussing and arguing with the Inquisition and having to you know, that you think about these stories of Pur si muove and things like that. I think you need to train people like that. you know, people perhaps who won't even say, okay, Inquisition, you're right, and perhaps they will, people who will dare to say a Pursi Mov, it still moves loud and clear. And that's the sort of thing that a university should aspire to, and what students should aspire to as well. We live in a very complex world, a world in which we'll see things we've never imagined. If any of yourselves had seen in a film in the year 2000 what happened on 9/11 here, I would have thought it was another Hollywood film. But this happened. This was not a film. It was true. And this changed history. When do you realize that a moment is a watershed moment in history? When, after the events, even long after, you remember what you were doing. I can't remember what I was doing when the Berlin Wall fell, I promise. But I can tell you in every detail what I was doing, who called me, and everything about the day the planes crashed into the Twin Towers. I think that was a watershed moment, just as another milestone was the discovery of the Americas, which some view as positive, some not, depending on which way you look at it. We don't want to get into trouble with the indigenous peoples. The best thing you can ask a university to do is to help you open up your mind and help you think for yourselves and look at the world for yourselves. And we'll need a lot of people who won't have, who can think outside of the box, people who will be open to other things, but will have to deal with new problems. And as a political leader and as the president of a country that is in the G20, one of the biggest problems to deal with a crisis today is that we see no ideas to overcome the crisis, which is not economic, it is political. There is no clear idea as to the way out. And if the idea is there, it's obviously not being disclosed because it might harm those most privileged by what's happened. No economic situation is neutral. What you take away from one goes to the other. It's a basic economic rule. So I think that's what I would cherish. I don't want to be told that I'm right. I would find that boring. I think universities must teach and help think freely. That's the best legacy of any university, Georgetown or otherwise.
Aquí con
We are here with our students and professors to open minds, not to break the head, but to open it. Break sometimes, but open minds. With the permission of the president, I shall give precedence to the students to give them the opportunity to ask questions. So you over there, I would like to say young man. Yes, you, please. Well, thank you. And thank you, President, for having come here. I am from Michigan. I am still learning my Spanish. It's better than my English. Excellent. I have a question, a very simple question, but a question which I know many Argentinians have to ask today. Why we, the students in Georgetown, have the opportunity to speak with you when in Argentina, forget it with me, when you have not spoken to the press in Argentina for many years.
Well, that's the question. End of the question. Well, actually, I do speak every day. Now, speaking to the press, I talk a lot to the press when I go to ceremonies, there are interviews. The thing is, in Argentina, when they say that you don't talk to the press, it's actually because you're not telling them what they want to hear. whoever goes to any of the political rallies or ceremonies I attend in the greater Buenos Aires area or in other provinces, whatever questions anyone may ask, I answer. Of course, I don't talk all the time, but some journalists don't like it when I don't answer what they want to hear. But it's part of the freedom to ask and the freedom to answer. I think I can also assure you that when some questions are asked in certain circles, and I have talked a lot to the press at the government house of Buenos Aires. What I don't do is have regular press briefings or press conferences. I would like you to come to one of our press conferences in Argentina, and you'll see how when a journalist doesn't like something, they start yelling and making a whole fuss and scandal. Not all of them, but some ministers have actually been given a conference at the conference room. You see, when I look at President Obama and he gives a conference, the journalists ask a question, the president answers, and that's it. But in Argentina, when they don't like the answer you give, they shout, they get mad at you. They may even kick a door. They even kicked a door in the conference room because they didn't like the answer. A journalist of a 100-year-old newspaper, I don't want to say prestigious newspaper, but this newspaper is over 100 years old. But if we could have conferences within a framework of civilized respect, the way it is around the world, but I don't think that we rulers or leaders are there just to answer questions at press conferences. That shouldn't be the center of our activity. I think some journalists believe that the interviewer is more important than the interviewee, or that the job of a political leader is to answer questions and talk to the media. What a government must do is ensure the publicity of the government action. Of course, that is an obligation. And the press, you see, unlike the case in the United States, where the press clearly says who they side with, I remember during the Obama campaign, the Washington Post and the New York Times told their readers that they were supporting President Obama's campaign. And I think that's very good, that each newspaper or media group explains clearly to the readers or to their audiences that they hold a certain position, that they support this candidate or that candidate, because that is fair on the reader, on the audience, because they will know who the media are supporting. But this is not the case in my country. If you talk to a journalist, they're all independent, but they're independent only independent of the Spanish crown. No one is independent in the world. I mean, you look at the world from a certain perspective. You're from Michigan, you're American, you may like the Democrats, you may like the Republicans, you may like the Tea Party. I mean, you have a perspective, a standpoint. You can't say that you are independent as such, because independent would mean something dull, you know, insipid, no ideas. What I like about the US press, at least what I consider the most serious US press, clearly state their support for a candidate or another, and they don't claim to be independent or objective. In my country, we don't have independent or objective press either. If you look at the news portals, I dare say no president, no woman president has probably been criticized more harshly, insulted, and slandered more than I have been. And still, I sent the draft bill that eliminated the crime of slander and for journalists. If a journalist had actually written something against someone, they could be sued for libel and slander. And I sent a bill to Congress for any journalist to be able to say what they want and for them not to have to go to prison. Of course, needless to say, they had to pay for damages if they slandered someone. What was your name again? You said you were from Michigan. Gavin, I would like you to come to Argentina. I can invite you to come over to a press conference and you will understand very quickly how this works.
In the center there, the gentleman with glasses. My name is Chris. I'm from Austin, Texas. I'm in my final year of my studies here in Georgetown and my first year in my master's in the Center for Latin American Studies. I am learning Spanish like Gavin. You have to hurry. He came first and he speaks better. Okay. My question is, how would you respond to the recent statements of the IMF on the rate of inflation, the inflation rate of your country?
Dario,
The IMF doesn't talk about the inflation rate, but about statistics in Argentina. Mrs. Lagarde, the head of the IMF, threatened to give Argentina a red card. I think, aside from the rather infelicitous statement, the position of the IMF is clearly contrary to Argentina. Let me ask, what were the Spanish statistics or the Greek statistics or those of Portugal or Britain or of the United States? I mean, what is inflation in this country officially? Nearly 3%? 2%? Do you all really believe that the cost of living in the United States increases only 2% a year? How much does your university tuition fee increase every year, or the cost of, I don't know, airfares, tickets? I mean, honestly, the IMF seems to be taking it out on Argentina. Why? Because we are the bad example. We are the bad student. We said no to each and every one of the recipes that they're trying to impose upon us since 2003, but not due to ideological reasons. We have nothing against the IMF in the ideological field. The issue with the IMF is that it led us to the worst tragedy in the history of Argentina by supporting the currency board and supporting an indebtedness policy. The IMF, instead of becoming what Bretton Woods intended in the context of the World War, trying to get it to be the big economic regulator, it's very interesting to look at the charter, the foundational charter of the IMF, and look at its obligations. If you look at what its duties are, you would have to send away all of the managers or amend the charter, because both things are inconsistent. And why is this so? Argentina is a bad example. How can you explain to the world today, especially the Eurozone countries that have exactly the same problems Argentina had? The sovereign debt increasing manifold GDP. And the situation was even worse, because in Argentina it was the state that was highly indebted, but the families, and it's true we have an informal economy in Argentina, that's one of our problems, but families manage to recover. But the level of debt of any Spanish household or family today, or in any other Eurozone country, is equal to that of the public sector. So you've got the public sector indebted to the financial sector with no possibility of pumping funds into the economy. The families are indebted too. They can't consume, or even worse, they lose their jobs and therefore refrain from spending. It's clear that the only way out is to restructure sovereign debts in order to enable part of those who kept vast amounts of money. We probably can't even imagine their existence, because I think often it's just accounting entries. When they say that a company is worth so many million or $billion, or that another company purchased a third company, do you think that money exists physically in a tangible manner? No. And the IMF obviously considers us to be the bad student and has to be fined and admonished and punished. How are statistics measured here in the United States? A country in which the current account in Argentina, which is key to evaluate the economic situation, is positive by over $1 billion. Do you know what the negative figure of the current account in the United States is? Well, if it had been any other country, they would have closed you down. And obviously, this is not done because the United States issues the world reserve currency. 85% of world transactions are in US dollars, and 60% of the world's bank reserves are in dollars too. So if you look at the fiscal and current account deficit here, it's the highest in the world. But no rule or sanction is imposed on the United States. Look at Greece. Where are the Greek statistics? Were they real? Did they issue any warnings to Greece, to Spain, to Portugal? I think behind all this, it's not just the statistics or the economy. It's a profoundly political issue. It's about punishing those who may seem a bad example, which is nonsense, really. It is very silly, or not. Obviously, if you want the world economy to recover, we should be observed, perhaps not to be imitated, but at least to consider what they have done and what we have done in order to grow, especially because it's the emerging economies that have sustained growth over the last 10 years. Argentina, since 2003, has had the highest growth in its 200-year-long history. No matter what measurement you use, the highest level of reserves accumulated in history, the biggest debt reduction process in history. And we even decided to pay off our debt to the IMF, as well as Brazil did, because we didn't want to be bound to abide by IMF recipes. This is why I think, honestly, someone tripped up Mrs. Lagarde or something went wrong. I think the referee, you know, when a referee sides with one of the players, we say that they're being biased, and because they're obviously supporting one side. And I think many emerging countries feel that the IMF is a referee that supports the developed nations that triggered the crisis, and which are in a way transferring the crisis to emerging countries too. If I were to say something else, I would be telling a lie. This is something that can be verified.
We believe in diversity. It's time for a lady or a young woman. The young woman in a white shirt. Voy a hacer mi pregunta en español.
Estamos mostrando.
We are showing the world, above all the Argentine world, that everybody here in Georgetown speaks Spanish. Just one little word?
Mi español no es bueno.
My Spanish is not good. I speak a little. Mi nombre es Nicole Thomas. Estoy en mi segundo año acá. Estamos en estudios comparativos de la América Latina. Y claro que he escuchado acerca de animosidad contra el FMI y contra los argentinos. Quitarlos de la ecuación y hablando acerca de la tasa de inflación y cómo han respondido la gente a lo que ha sido publicado. Porque lo que ha dicho su gobierno recientemente es que cualquiera, que usted puede vivir con 6 pesos al día y se le añade lo de FMI de los 6 pesos por día, y esto es más allá de la tasa de pobreza. Yo pienso que en cuanto a la tasa de inflación en su país nomás, cómo responden a esto la gente y cómo responden ustedes a su idea de que no es una representación correcta de lo que está.
Primero, Nicole, quiero decir
Well, first of all, Nicole, let me say that I have nothing against the IMF. I just take a critical position. I have nothing against the IMF. I may have something against the opposite football team, of course, or someone that I may not be particularly fond of. But when I act institutionally, representing my government, I am unbiased and objective. Now, this thing about the 6 pesos was obviously inaccurately publicized and published. It's too bad that you haven't been able to get the accurate information, but we'll let you have the official government communiques and releases on this. And I'll come back to this in a minute. Again, you see, one thing is what is written and what is finally conveyed or relayed. Some time ago, we brought into circulation a banknote with the effigy of Eva Perón. And a couple of days ago, a newspaper said that this banknote couldn't fit into the tellers, the ATMs, that it couldn't be used. Well, now it is circulating. This is just to give an idea. Now, regarding the figures, I was reading the paper, or at least the agenda today, and if you look at the budget of the government of the city of Buenos Aires, which is the opposition party, and this I read it in a newspaper that deals with economics. It's called El Cronista Comercial. And it says that Macri being the mayor of Buenos Aires, fixed the inflation rate at 10%, consistent with INDEC, which is an Argentine statistics office. But one of the main opponents to our policies, the mayor of Buenos Aires, the mayor, as an institutional representative and official, accepts the Argentine Statistics Office inflation rate. And let me say that what the IMF has taken into account has been the figures of private think tanks, which talked about 20-24% inflation rate. And they have been reported because there are laws in Argentina that state that in order to give economic data that may have an impact on economic activity, you need to provide sound, hard data. And none of these consultants or think tanks have been able to produce any statistical instruments to back their claims. And they have recognized that they don't have the structure to justify this. The only ones that have the resources, professional and otherwise, to take surveys of the cost of living, of poverty and extreme poverty levels, social mobility, balance of trade, and so on and so forth, is INDEC, the statistics office. And there's something that has to do with logic, pure logic. If inflation were really 24%, and if the average increase in wages has been 25%, if investment in 2011 has been highest than ever at almost 25%, how come the economy grew at 9.2% in 2010 or at 8.9% last year? How come we had a trade surplus of over $10 billion last year, and this year a surplus which, as of end of August, reaches 10 billion? Again, as in the case of Gavin, I would like to invite you, Nicole, to come to Buenos Aires and see what consumption is in Buenos Aires. You could do some sightseeing in Buenos Aires, a beautiful city. You could see full restaurants, full shopping malls, people buying, consuming. We have a social policy that reaches out to the most vulnerable sectors, the ones who less save and most consume. The number of Argentines who travel abroad, I've met a lot in New York. Maravilla Martinez, the boxer, won in Las Vegas, and it was full of Argentines watching the fight there. And if we really had inflation of 25 to 26%, the country would be blowing up, and we wouldn't have been able to pay any of the millions and millions of dollars we've paid back. We wouldn't have been able to sustain the growth of the economy the way we have done. And less still, would we have been able to incorporate millions of people formerly excluded who can now buy and consume and who now get the universal child benefit or work in a cooperative or have formal employment. So it's economic reality. You know, there is an inconsistency between the data on growth and on the economy. What the opposition says often has to do with a political matter rather than economic matter. But finally, regarding the concept of inflation, aside from digits and statistics, let me say that this economic and political model and policy, this project, unlike the consensus of Washington model pursued in the 1990s, has no inflation targets, but rather growth targets. And what is the difference? I don't know if we have many students of economics here, but the difference is very important. And that may be one of the key reasons why we can't get out of the global crisis. In the Eurozone, and I attend the G20 meetings, so I can bear witness to this, there is a fear of monetary expansion. Look at what the United States has done. With the monetary expansion here, if you tell me that the United States has 2% inflation only, it's clear that they've flung millions and millions of dollars at the banks. I don't say that is wrong. You had to bail out the banks, industry, but the greatest monetary expansion in the world is that of the United States. And I'm told that inflation is 2%. We may have some economists here who may confirm whether this is consistent. I think it's unrealistic. With such an enormous monetary expansion, and it's not wrong for that to be done, because it is in the DNA of the United States to think back to the crisis in the 1930s. And growth is more important than inflation. But in Germany, Angela Merkel, for instance, has DNA, inflation, it's DNA. Germany is convinced that the advent of Hitler was due to inflation. And I don't think it was so. Remember, if you've read your history, they say that Germans, at the height of the crisis, had to take a wheelbarrow with banknotes to buy bread, or that they would even paper the walls over with banknotes because they were worth nothing. And it's in the German DNA to think that inflation was what led to Hitler. Mistaken. One of the worst totalitarian regimes, that of Hitler's, was the result of the Treaty of Versailles. After the end of the First World War, this imposed very serious, terrible conditions on Germany, which led to the Republic of Weimar and to inflation. That was a true reason for Hitler's advent. And this is what led to the emergence of totalitarian regimes. And yesterday, during my address at the UN General Assembly, I stated this. My greatest concern, not only as a president and member of the international community, but as a politician and citizen who has suffered a lot, suffered firsthand the lack of democracy, our world has allowed us now to express ourselves democratically, and not everyone thinks in the same way. Of course, other peoples want to live differently from the way we want to live. And my big fear is that young people and younger generations, the main victims of the lack of work, the main victims of economic crises, may eventually turn their back on these values and systems of Western democracy as we know it if they fail to get an answer. And this has been the germ of totalitarian regimes throughout history. So our model is not one of inflation targets, again, one of growth targets it is. When you have very high growth, there is a certain degree of inflation, but it's far from being the ridiculous, absurd, inconsistent figures that some publish and that no one can actually justify or prove.
The question is, the gentleman who has a slight red shirt on. No, the other one. Behind. There are two of them. In my country, they call rajado, like is a nut. First one and then the other. Oh, can you take two questions? So, Mrs. President, my name is, Paul Kalipstot. I'm a graduate of this university in Latin American issues. So this is such an important chair of history. in Argentina. Where are you from? My parents are from Haiti. Oh, from Haiti. I was thinking Haiti.
Argentina es un país.
We are actually on MINUSTA, you know. MINUSTA is, you may know, is a peace mission of the United Nations, which is active in Haiti, and the armed forces play a very significant role in the context of MINUSTA. The armed forces of Argentina only take part in peacekeeping missions of the United Nations. We are in Haiti, in Cyprus, and in Haiti we run the hospital with very good results. And we're also working very much in fruit and vegetable gardens for social inclusion. The situation in Haiti is very serious, of course. And the IMF also had to do with this, you know. No, it's no hostility, Nicole. Haitians used to grow rice. You all know about this. And the IMF recommended that they stop growing rice and that they go into services. Now they have neither services nor rice.
Go ahead. Thank you, President. The question at a regional level. Can tell the requirements for Paraguay to join Aguasur? That's a good question. We'll go to the second question. Conasur, Paraguay, okay. You spoke a bit about the threats against democracy, so I wanted to ask you that in 2 weeks we have elections in Venezuela. If Chavez does not accept the results, and what this bring about, leading to Venezuela's being kicked out of UNASUR. What was your name? Well, Manuel Yirchu.
I loved your question, Manuel. Haiti first and Paraguay. I love these crisp, fresh questions. I love, you know, Haiti. Well, Haiti first. Anyway, Haiti. I forget your name, so Paraguay. There was a virtual coup in Paraguay, and in a sham impeachment process, they ousted President Lugo. This is not just the view of President Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner. I would be alone if it was just me. It was actually the same view of all UNASUR and Mercosur members. Let me begin by Mercosur, because it is actually Mercosur that Paraguay is a full member of, and there is a clause, the so-called democratic clause, adopted in the city of Ushuaia in the south, in which it is said that any country that fails to respect the authorities democratically elected by the people will be separated for as long as the situation continues to last. And this clause was subsequently adopted over by UNASUR, which is a bit of an extended Mercosur as it assembles all countries of South America. And we all indeed agreed that there had been an illegal institutional interruption which had been disguised by a sham impeachment process. And I say this firsthand. In addition to being president, I served as a senator, so I know what an impeachment process is about. In fact, I presided over the Constitutional Affairs Committee of the Senate of Argentina, which impeached 2 members of the Supreme Court of Argentina. And every trial and judicial process requires due process, the guarantees that must be respected when someone is accused. First of all, the person must know what they're accused of. That's basic. Secondly, they must be given time to defend themselves. Then there must be evidence on both sides. And these processes last at least a month, 2 months. I remember the impeachment of 2 justices of the Supreme Court took at least 90 days. And the, in inverted commas, impeachment of Fernando Lugo lasted 24 hours. Obviously, every rule of due process was violated, which is what guarantees the legitimacy of any impeachment, whether it be a president or a trial of any ordinary citizen. So this was a decision that UNASUR adopted in leaving Paraguay out. But we didn't adopt economic sanctions. We know that those economic sanctions don't damage the rulers of countries, but the people. So these are only political sanctions, and they will last until the election takes place, I suppose, during the course of next year. This is what all UNASUR and Mercosur members hope. Paraguay should come back into the organization. And during my last intervention at the meeting of UNASUR, in fact, something similar and even a lot more serious happened in the case of Honduras. I am almost 60, so my memory is not as quick as yours. You remember the president was taken out in his pajamas, put in a neighboring country, and there was this tug of war. Of course, we didn't recognize the government of Honduras, and I think this is good for Manuel too. You said Manuel, right? At the behest of President Santos from Colombia and of President Chavez from Venezuela, President Porfirio Lobo was, or Honduras, was again accepted within the context of Central America and of our regional associations. They both acted as go-betweens. Santos and Chavez mediated, and for the sake of the unity of the bloc, to keep the homogeneity of the bloc, many of us didn't agree with this. But in order to preserve the unity of UNASUR, it was decided to accept this, which was at the behest of Chavez, who had also obviously opposed this ouster of the then president. So based on all of the South American and Latin American experience in the Department of Coups, when it comes to preserving democracy, you need to be very strict. If you don't like the president, wait until the next election, let the people change the president. But no sector of the population, no power group can skip the constitutional due process or guarantees in order to overthrow a president. This would be tantamount to going back to a new form of coup, no longer staged by the armed forces, but by other forces, you know, the police, as in the case of Correa, or a vice president, or parliamentarians. Although, in the case of Lugo, I must say that was a government that had no legislators of its own. The coalition had no legislators of its own, but this doesn't justify the opposition not respecting the constitution, because everyone, government, opposition, president, and everyone else must abide by the constitution. And the answer for Manuel from Venezuela. Very nice name, Manuel. You assume that Chavez will lose. So this is why you're asking what Chavez will do. So that's an assumption. I really think he has always respected things. In fact, I always tease Chavez, who's my friend. I think everyone knows about this. There's probably no other Latin American president who's gone through more election process than Chavez has. Since 2009, I mean, ever since he's been in politics, but in '92 he staged a coup. I think you represent the opposition, but we shouldn't actually distort facts. 14 elections. Let's take one bit at a time, as Jack the Ripper said. I don't think anyone who doesn't believe in democracy would go to so many elections. In fact, when he lost a referendum, he recognized he'd lost the referendum. I don't think there's any reason why we should think he would not accept an election result. He's already lost, and he recognized this. And in '92, in fact, the coup was against him. In 2000, you're talking about the coup in 1992, with Andrés Pérez, the Caracazo. You're talking about the Caracazo. You're talking about the so-called Caracazo. There was an attempt to then overthrow Andrés Pérez, which he said he was going to do something, and after the election he didn't, and many people died. He ended up in prison. But the one who, well, he himself, Chavez, suffered a coup in 2002, went through Fedecámaras, the chambers of commerce federations, led to him being in prison, in fact. And the only government in the world that recognized President Carmona, or Carmona as president of Venezuela, was the government of the United States. And the IMF, of course, was meant to be. The IMF and the United States recognized Carmona as president. So I think aside from the differences in styles and in views, I often have my differences with Hugo. We all do, between and amongst ourselves. We have different views because we are different. Obviously, the ways of an Argentine person are different from those of a person from the Caribbean. And I'm not saying that one is better or one is worse. But the democratic beliefs of President Chavez after 13 elections, even having recognized that he lost, I think it's unfair on him. I remember the first time, and I'll wrap it up here, and in connection with the media, the first time I went to Venezuela, it was the meeting of 15 in 2004, which was held in Caracas. And there was a big demonstration by the opposition. And I was surprised to see what the newspapers said in the headlines about the president. In fact, when I became president, it was no longer surprising to me. They said even worse things about me than about Chavez. But the climate of freedom there is, anyone can say whatever they want and do, at least that's what I saw. I saw demonstrations by the opposition. I actually wanted to see for myself. And I was very interested in the Cuban missions, and I went on my own to a barrio, an area in the higher areas of Caracas. I wanted to visit the Cuban medical missions, and I remember I just wore trainers and jeans. It was in the Catia barrio, you know, a very a popular neighborhood of Caracas, and even the Venezuelan security didn't want to take me, nor did my own security want to go there. So I actually got hold of a taxi driver who knew about the place, and he said, I know a Cuban physician who works in Caracas, and well, I went there into a house. I was received by a typical lady of the area with a dark complexion. I remember her very well. And when the driver explained what I wanted, the lady said, wait a minute, please. Close the door. And then a while later, someone else came along, double-checked, checked that I was who I purported to be, and the doctor did come and told me what they were doing about preventive health and how they help people who formerly had to travel through half Caracas to reach hospital, and he talked about the literacy campaigns. It is a complex political process, I believe, in Venezuela. I always compare that with the early Peronist period of the 1940s to 1950s, because it unleashed a very strong confrontation in a society in which those who had access to certain goods and assets were only a minority. And the people who live up on the hills, I know Caracas, and you know, when you get to Caracas, it's quite impressive because it's as if you were surrounded by mountains of lights. And in the morning you can see it's an endless string of tiny houses, rows and rows of houses where hundreds of thousands of Caracas residents live. And when the coup against Chavez took place and he was detained and taken somewhere else, and when Carmona was elected president, and I've seen this in a documentary on this, you could see how thousands and thousands of the people from the hills went down to defend Chavez. And of course, other sectors of the population have the right to feel and think otherwise. But that's what a democracy is about, knowing that you can think differently. And unlike the case of true dictatorships, if you thought differently, you were tortured, you were disappeared. Fortunately, in South America, this is no longer the case here. How old are you, Manuel? You have no idea what that means. You were born into a democratic South America. You have no idea what it was to be 22 when I was 22. You were afraid to be young. Being young was a sin, was suspicious. So I think what matters is understanding diversity, not tolerating it. I don't like the word tolerate, because tolerate sounds as if you had to put up with something because you have no choice. That's what I feel when I hear tolerance. I like the word acceptance. Accepting those who are different. Accepting the fact that others think differently. And, you know, leaving South America and Venezuela, and probably in order to wrap it up, I don't know what the president says, but I will have a meeting at the IDB in a while. I think the most important thing that is happening to us in the world now, and this is something I said yesterday, when I regretted and obviously condemned once again the death of Chris Stevens, the former US ambassador to Libya. I believe we must have a broader view of the world. We must understand that we, of course, defend democracy and a way of life and the way we dress and the way we feel, but there are people who feel different. I would never wear a headscarf. You will probably never wear a turban or think that a woman needs to walk 2 steps behind you. You may want to go hand in hand with your girlfriend, fiancé, or whoever, and you need to understand as well that others may choose to live differently. And this is key in order to build a safer world. If we are able to accept that others wish to live differently, obviously without attacking us, but we shouldn't attack them either. It should all be within a context of respect, acceptance, plurality, and diversity. I think many of the problems that seem insoluble today will be resolved. And we need to again recognize a value that was key to all of Western civilization. Throughout the French Revolution, throughout the revolution here in the United States, and in every liberation revolution in the Americas, the value of equality, a value that is being trampled underfoot today. Within societies in which inequalities exist between people who, and among people who have no work, no place to live, and those, on the other hand, who have everything. And of course, there's inequality between nations. Those who have a lot of power can violate UN resolutions, such as the UK. And to conclude, Malvinas. Britain, a permanent member of the UN Security Council. There are a whole lot of resolutions by the UN, by the Decolonization Committee, ever since 1965, which called upon the UK to engage in dialogue. Not for them to tell Argentina that we're right. Dialogue between Argentina and the UK. And the and the resolutions have never been respected. Next year will mark 180 years since the UK usurped the Malvinas Islands. The sovereignty of Argentina has been unanimously recognized by all of the American continent and by many other countries. There is a sovereignty issue. We haven't even been able to get to the dialogue phase. And why? Because they're members, permanent members of the Security Council and NATO members, so they are entitled to violate UN resolutions. However, all other countries which don't have M16s or which are not permanent members of the Security Council must strictly abide by each and every one of the UN resolutions, which I'm proud of doing, of course. But there is no equality there either. As long as this inequality, social and global, continues, we'll be far away from the solutions that most people in this world wish for in order to live with more peace of mind and more safely with their families, and for everyone to be able to come and meet, such as on this beautiful afternoon in Georgetown, to come and listen to a president from South America. Thank you very much, and a good afternoon to you all.
Magnífico.